Thousands of years ago, long before humans could see bacteria or understand why food spoiled, something remarkable was already happening. People were milking animals, drinking fresh milk, and transforming it into cheese and other foods that could last far longer. With no refrigerators and no modern science, how did they learn these ancient secrets? The surprising answer is that they didn't need to understand germs to discover ways of dealing with them. They learned through observation, experience, and sometimes painful trial and error. The story begins with one of humanity's biggest changes, the domestication of animals. Thousands of years ago, people began keeping animals such as goats, sheep, and eventually cattle. These animals weren't just useful for meat, they could provide something extremely valuable: milk. Unlike an animal that could only be killed once for food, a living goat or cow could produce milk again and again. For communities trying to survive, this was a revolutionary source of nutrition. But there was an obvious problem. Milk doesn't stay fresh forever. Without a refrigerator, fresh milk could quickly change, especially in warm environments. Ancient people may not have known that microorganisms were responsible, but they could certainly see the results. Milk left sitting around would develop a sour smell, change texture, or become unpleasant to drink. And sometimes, consuming contaminated food could make someone seriously ill. So did ancient humans simply drink fresh milk immediately? Sometimes, yes. Freshly collected milk could be consumed soon after milking, especially when people were living close to their animals. But they also discovered something fascinating. Milk could be transformed into foods that lasted much longer. One of the most important discoveries was fermentation. When milk was left under certain conditions, naturally occurring microorganisms could change its sugars and proteins. The milk became sour and thicker, producing foods similar to yogurt or other fermented dairy products. Ancient people didn't know about bacteria or fermentation chemistry. They simply noticed a pattern. If we do this, the milk changes, and sometimes the new food lasts longer. This kind of accidental discovery probably happened many times in different places. A container of milk might have been forgotten for a while. Instead of throwing it away, someone could taste it and realize that the changed milk was still edible. Over generations, people learned which smells, textures, and flavors were normal and which ones meant the food should be discarded.
Then came another breakthrough: cheese. Cheese was an extraordinary solution to the problem of preserving milk. Fresh milk contains a lot of water, which makes it highly perishable. By turning milk into curds and separating much of the liquid whey, people could create a denser food that was easier to store and transport. Salt could also be added, helping preserve certain cheeses. Ancient people didn't need microscopes to understand this process. They needed experience. They learned that milk treated in certain ways could become a stable food. Some of the earliest evidence for dairying goes back thousands of years, showing that milk processing was already part of ancient food systems. But here's where things become even more interesting. Ancient humans probably had their own version of food safety rules, even without knowing why those rules worked. They learned to use clean containers. They learned that certain materials were better for storing food. They learned to process milk in particular ways. They learned from elders who had already made mistakes. And they learned to recognize foods that looked or smelled dangerous. Think about that for a moment. Modern humans might say, "Don't drink this because harmful microorganisms could be growing inside." An ancient person couldn't say that, but they could say, "That milk smells wrong. Throw it away." That is an important distinction. Knowledge doesn't always begin with scientific explanations. Sometimes it begins with patterns. Ancient people were incredibly good at recognizing patterns because their survival depended on it. They watched animals, weather, plants, seasons, fire, and food. If something repeatedly caused illness, people could learn to avoid it, even if they had absolutely no idea what was causing the problem. Of course, ancient dairy consumption was not perfectly safe. People still became sick. There was no guarantee that a traditional method would eliminate every dangerous organism. In fact, some dairy products could carry serious risks. Ancient people survived not because they had perfect food safety, but because generations of experience gradually improved their methods. And there was another powerful trick: heat. People discovered the usefulness of cooking and heating food long before modern microbiology existed. Heating milk could change its taste and behavior, and in many circumstances, heat could reduce some harmful microorganisms. They didn't understand pasteurization in the modern scientific sense, but they understood something practical. Heating food could make it safer or make it last differently. This is one of the most fascinating things about ancient technology. Many technologies existed long before humans understood the science behind them. People used fire before understanding combustion. They made bread before understanding yeast. They fermented foods before discovering microorganisms. They navigated by the stars before developing modern astronomy. Milk was another example of this pattern. Imagine an ancient herder returning home with a container of fresh milk. There is no refrigerator waiting inside the house. There is no expiration date written on the container. There is no laboratory testing the milk. Instead, the person relies on time, temperature, smell, appearance, experience, and tradition. Maybe the milk is consumed immediately. Maybe it is turned into a fermented food. Maybe it becomes cheese. Maybe it is heated. And if it looks suspicious, perhaps it is simply thrown away. These decisions may seem primitive to us, but they were actually forms of practical science. Ancient humans were constantly conducting experiments without calling them experiments. They changed one thing, watched what happened, remembered the result, and passed the information to the next generation. The biggest mystery, however, is how humans learned to drink milk in the first place. For most mammals, drinking milk is something associated with infancy. But humans eventually developed the ability to consume animal milk as part of their adult diet. This was not equally useful for everyone. Genetic adaptations allowing some populations to digest lactose more easily in adulthood became common in several dairying populations over thousands of years. In other words, dairy culture and human biology influenced each other over long periods of history. So the story of ancient milk isn't simply about a person discovering a cow and drinking from it. It is a much bigger story about domestication, experimentation, food preservation, culture, and human adaptation. And perhaps the most impressive part is this: ancient humans were living in a world they couldn't see completely. They couldn't see bacteria multiplying inside their food. They couldn't see microscopic contamination on their hands or containers. They couldn't measure temperature precisely. They couldn't identify individual pathogens. But they could observe consequences. They could see that some milk stayed good longer than other milk. They could see that fermented milk behaved differently. They could see that certain foods made people sick. They could see that some methods worked better than others. And slowly, across generations, those observations became traditions. Today, when we open a carton of milk, we expect it to come with a printed expiration date. We put it in a refrigerator and trust a huge system of science, sanitation, transportation, and food regulation. Ancient humans had none of that. Instead, they had something much older: observation. They didn't know about germs, but they knew that food could go bad. They didn't know about bacteria, but they knew that some milk changed. They didn't know about microbiology, but they discovered fermentation. And they didn't understand the chemistry of cheese, but they learned how to make it. That is perhaps one of the greatest lessons from ancient history. Humans didn't need to understand why something worked before they could learn how to make it work. Long before microscopes revealed the invisible world, our ancestors were already experimenting with it, one bowl of milk at a time.
And that simple discovery helped transform milk from a fragile liquid into yogurt, cheese, and other foods that could feed communities for generations. So the next time you pour a glass of milk, remember, behind that ordinary drink is a story thousands of years old, a story that began with animals, curiosity, mistakes, and humans learning to survive in a world they could not yet see. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into ancient human survival, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and join us for the next strange question from human history.